Good morning from Washington, D.C. to Bucharest and Europe. And thank you to the Aspen Institute, Romania, and to Defense Minister Kuka for his introduction and the opportunity to discuss our panel, Investing in Defense for Economic Recovery, or the other way around. I'm Kimberly Dozier, a Time Magazine contributor and CNN Global Affairs analyst, and I'm joined by Soren Dukaru, Director of the European Satellite Center, Ben Hodges, who is the Persian Chair in Strategic Studies at the Center for European Policy Analysis, Harlan Ullman, Chairman of the Kilowan Group, and Radu Tudor, Political and Military Analyst. Now, I'd like to start us off with a lightning round question. How has the pandemic changed the national security map? What has it altered? Radu, can we start with you?
Yes, thank you, Kim, for this honor. I'm great. It's a great pleasure for me to be with such a moderator and such a good panelist. I think this crisis is a huge opportunity for us to understand that the dual use of civilian and military must be enforced starting now. If we are looking the way it has been managed, all the crises starting February or March, we saw that so many military capabilities were used in the help of civilians, in help of the health system, in help of many other areas. And from my point of view, I think this will be the future of the resilience, a much stronger civilian military system in order to face all the threats that are coming, whether they are economic, political, sanitary or other. Because if we are looking the challenges we have here in the Black Sea, one of the most disputed areas in the last 7 years, then we saw so many aggressions, and the way that a strategic hub for Europe, for Asia, and even for a greater Middle East was transformed from a security sea and platform to an unstable area because of the Russian aggression to Ukraine and Georgia, and because of the instability that Russia has projected to the Middle East from the Black Sea and also from the Caspian Sea. So if we are looking also to the cyber attacks, to the all the propaganda that was launched on social media and all the websites and the internet, then we'll see somehow a small perfect storm with so many threats coming in only few months and years. And this pandemic raises the alarm that we need to be together. We cannot continue as separate systems, military and civilian, because we need one response, one success that we need to find at the end of this fight with many threats that are coming.
So I hear you saying that the pandemic has provided fertile soil for things like disinformation from various actors, including Russia. And also, I want to get back to later in our discussion that dual use idea. Is it dual use manufacturing? Is it dual use response because of the military's efficiency? But before we dig into that, since we're in a lightning round, Ben, let's go to you next.
Thanks, Kim. So I think five things. First, the pandemic has exposed some weaknesses in the societal resilience, certainly in the United States, but across Europe, in terms of just overall health and fitness. We're vulnerable, and it's exposed where we have gaps in our healthcare systems. So this is a weakness, several gaps that have been exposed that we've got to address. The second thing is how easily we can be distracted from threats. I mean, I hear an awful lot of countries talking about, well, it's like defense budgets are going to drop. That's a given. What you hear from some places, but the threat never changed. I mean, the Kremlin is still there. The Chinese Communist Party is still there. Islamic extremists are still there, and you can see from their actions that they're not slowing down. So the threat is still there. The third piece is mobility, military mobility. The virus does not know or see boundaries between countries. But yet, the natural instinct, including of the United States, was to immediately stop moving across borders. But medicine and healthcare workers and all the other things, we are so interconnected. We've got to figure out how to maintain mobility that is important for military purposes as well as for commercial and health purposes. And then finally, of course, the vulnerability of our supply chains. I mean, I think more people now realize how much we depend on China, for example, for really important things. This is obviously going to have to change.
Got it. Thank you. Soren, you next.
Well, let me. I fully agree with the points made by the previous speakers, especially by Ben. Let me add a couple of other elements. One would be the fact that this pandemic showed us a neglected dimension that can have impact upon our security and defense based on this societal weakness that Ben highlighted. So one lesson learned is let's not forget about some of these neglected dimensions. I would add to this pandemic threat also climate effects and so on. We tend to forget them, how much such climate changes could have effects upon security and defense. Secondly, I would highlight the point that this pandemic puts an extra burden upon the responsibility of those who are engaged in security and defense, because it makes everything so much more complicated. The operational engagements, the exercises, that mentioned mobility and so on. So it's not that the other threats disappear. Actually, we can see how conflicts or tensions escalate, but the response is made even more difficult. Then I would highlight that it also gives us the chance to look at the opportunity of technology in terms of I would say compensating some of these extra vulnerabilities. I think the fact that the digital dimension, the virtual space has saved economies, have saved our communications at times of less mobility is absolutely obvious. And you can see also when you watch the stock exchange, it was the NASDAQ that bumped back, recuperating and so on. And let me give another example, the space. With less mobility on Earth, the value of the space sensor, something that I'm engaged very much right now, is even more relevant from Earth observation, geolocation, and telecommunication. My last point, I wanted to highlight something that also Radu mentioned, and you actually, Kim, the fact that the civ-mil the link and interaction, the connectivity and interaction is even more evident in a situation like this. This was already something that was a factor defining our time, but in the pandemic we saw how much the things are even more interlinked, because, as was said, a societal vulnerability or a lack of resilience can definitely have an impact upon military activity and military responsibility as well.
A lot to dig into that, but from Harlan about his views on how the pandemic has changed the threat map. Harlan, you speak a lot about mutually assured disruptors in the pandemic. Those.
Let me make 3 points. First, the strategic paradigm, which has been based on great power competition, has been overtaken by what I call the new MAD. The old Cold War MAD was mutual assured destruction. The new MAD is massive attacks of disruption. The pandemic is perhaps the final warning. I list in a book that I'm writing 7 major disruptions that run from climate change to failed and failing government. And in my argument, I believe unless we focus on potentially existential threats that are coming from this disruption, climate change being the most obvious, but you take a look at social media, cyber, drones, debt, terror, and I think most importantly, failed and failing government. These are the areas where I think we have to put our focus. And while great power competition is important, I think it is not nearly as important in dealing with these disruptors, which really will change society and have. Second, if one goes back and looks carefully at the 1918 to 1920 pandemic, after the pandemic ended in the United States, we had the greatest economic boom in our history. Let me say that again. In 1920 and onwards, we had the greatest economic boom in our history. Electrification and automobiles led that boom. And the parallels today are 5G and things that we can do in terms of dealing with climate change, dealing with the prevention of these disruptors. Now, how do you do that? I argue that we need a massive infrastructure fund globally that can focus on these dual use technologies. The model, believe it or not, is what China is doing with dual use technologies for both the civilian and the defense and military sectors. And we ought to take a page out of their book. Thirdly, I think we need to take a look at defense in entirely different terms. I have argued for a long time for a porcupine defense, which enhances deterrence because it would disrupt any potential attack or thought of attack by use of drones, standoff missiles, means to deceive, confuse, and prevent an enemy from launching an attack. And I think that's really an essential way that we need to proceed because, quite frankly, given the cost of these systems from F-35s to aircraft carriers, we can't afford them. The conclusion is the new strategic paradigm, I think, should be based on preventing, containing, and containing massive attacks of disruption. The best way we can do this is with a global infrastructure fund with dual use. We need leadership to do that. Sadly, that leadership currently is not coming from the United States. Whether it can come from Europe, I do not know. But I think somebody needs to take up that gauntlet and lead because without it, I'm afraid massive attacks of disruption are going to make the future probably far more unsettled than we've seen for a very long time.
I love your idea of a global infrastructure fund, speaking as a global citizen, but I've seen even in a place like the United States, which is prosperous, it has a crumbling infrastructure that it has struggled to fund, even though there's bipartisan support for it. But I'd like to pivot off of the economic boom you talked about, together with Radu's mention of dual-use technology and as both Ben and Soren were talking about, the supply chain vulnerabilities that we've seen because of the pandemic. How could investing in defense post-pandemic solve some of the problems that we've seen? What do we need to change to make Europe, make the United States safer in case of another such biological attack? In this case, by nature. Who wants
Do you
to
want me
dig
to
in
respond to
first?
that, Kim?
Well, Radu,
I,
you had talked about dual use. Can you tell
yes.
us what you meant by that?
Yes, Kim, thank you. Excellent ideas from all those panelists, from Ben Hodges, Sorin Ducaro, and Harlan Ullman. I want to underline two examples. One, how many NATO planes were used in the last 9 months in order to help all the health system around the world? Maybe thousands of flights were made by NATO planes. So if we are investing in military planes, in transport military planes with strategic capability, then all the states will benefit in terms of economic and health system, because I'm not sure that this will be the last provocation with this new coronavirus. I think there are many others to come, especially if we are talking about climate change and all the provocation that human habitats with the developments of them are posing to the planet. So this is one example. NATO maybe is the best choice of political and military use and response to a crisis when tens of military planes are putting their capabilities for civilian governments and for maybe like 1 billion people, helping them to get medical equipments, to get medicines, and everything they need to face this pandemic. And the second example I will give you with the recent announcement from the 3Cs initiative. It has been announced that the United States will support to this 3Cs initiative project to build a highway between Warsaw and Constanța. You know, it's kind of a strategic line on the eastern flank of NATO to have a highway between Constanța and Warsaw, and also a high-speed train between Warsaw and Constanța. We will have hundreds of companies working for this project with thousands of working places and benefits for the economic. And also an excellent opportunity for the mobility that General Hodges underlined so well. We need military mobility on the eastern flank in order to face all the threats that are coming from the far east or close east, from Russia and from China. So if we want to put in place this kind of response, allied response for threats that are coming, whether they are the pandemic or military or non-military threats, we have to build certain projects, and this kind of examples, I think, they are good to be followed in the next years.
So the same kind of infrastructure that Harlan was talking about, you could use it to speed, whether it's military responses or the kind of material and supplies that you need to treat a pandemic. Soren, how would you address the supply chain issue in a way that, again, would increase Europe's independence, which I know has been a big edict of Emmanuel Macron and others, and also of the US president, that Europe needs to stand on its own more?
Sure. That's the first time I've ever seen Soren speechless, so. I like what Harlan offers in terms of a framework and a construct, and I don't disagree with that, except I don't think that great power competition is exclusive from the framework that he's offered. In fact, I would say great power competition prevents great power conflict, because the competition is not just military, it's in all domains. It's diplomatic, in the information, and especially in economic investment. I mean, the reason we were worried about the Chinese is because we've kind of been standing on the sidelines while the Chinese have come in with huge investments. I think most everybody recognizes now these are debt traps, but nonetheless, they filled a vacuum because we were not competing. The 5G is, to me, the perfect example. Nokia, Ericsson, Samsung all make it good or better than Huawei, but Huawei, of course, gets billions of dollars of government support that Western governments, certainly from the United States, can't just dump money into a company like that. So we've got to figure out a way to compete rather than threatening our allies with, getting punished if they select Huawei. Now, I think that unfortunately, and of course I hope I'm wrong, but I think in 5 years we're going to be in a kinetic conflict with China. Not massive global conflict, but kinetic in the region, ships, planes, missiles, because of, number one, we know what they're doing in the South China Sea, and the language towards Taiwan is becoming increasingly threatening. The Chinese Communist Party saw that the collective we, did not really do anything against what they've done in Hong Kong. Not even the UK has responded strongly. So I think they see that, and they see us distracted. So we've got to compete in all of those domains. And, when you mentioned President Macron and strategic autonomy, I'm sure you all saw that there was a museum exhibit on Genghis Khan that was going to be in a museum in Paris. And the Chinese government complained so loudly about the way the words Mongolia was being referenced, that the French agreed to shut down the exhibit. So what kind of leverage does China have over the French that they would shut down an exhibit in one of their own museums over that kind of language? And so that's why I question strategic autonomy and why we need allies working together led by the United States.
So in other words, don't just say you're going to do it, but follow it up with action. And some of that action has to be dual-use manufacturing in the United States turned out to be a real boon for creating things like the ventilators that were needed in hospitals. Okay, Harlan, over to you.
First, the answer to your question is no. Defense is going to become the bill payer, and make no mistake about that. Second, unfortunately, Ben Hodges is probably right. We are on a collision course with China, largely of our own making. If you go back and think about the Vietnam War and the Second Iraq War, it was based on the wrong assumptions. And I think we've made many bad assumptions about China, despite its bad behavior in many areas. We talk about competing, but the only area we're really competing is in a military area, which we don't need to do, and we don't think about if we could have allies and make better use of them, which we are not. The way out of this is, and I've been arguing this for a long time, I think the two greatest threats we face right now are failed and failing government and environmental catastrophe through climate change. What we need is a infrastructure bank, which is part government and part private, which would be paid for by user fees, tolls, et cetera, in developing infrastructure.
But don't we
The
have
government can
structures
put in
like the World Bank?
writ large.
Aren't there?
And by the way, the infrastructures, for example, we are terribly weak in terms of our cyber hygiene and in terms of social media, the two areas where China and especially Russia are going to exploit us. Russia is doing an extraordinarily able job right now in interfering in NATO and interfering in the United States election. The Senate report on Russian interference is clear. We don't have sufficient cyber hygiene. As we move to 5G, there are ways that we can strengthen our networks, and that has direct application to defense. But I think that this has to be done through a private public sector infrastructure bank. In the United States, it needs to be about $2 trillion, which is going to be paid for with long-term bonds that provide perhaps 2% over prime. And as I said, they'll be paid off by user fees. The same thing can apply. We talked about the 3C initiative. One of the smartest things we could do would be to dredge the Danube to about 3 to 4 meters. That would take care of a lot of the mobility problems that Ben talks about in the military sense, but it would double the amount of trade and commerce that flows. The problem is we cannot get a sufficient agreement among governments to move ahead. So as Clausewitz said about war consists of the simplest of activities which are made impossible by fog and friction. Unless we break the fog and friction of failed and failing government, we're going to be talking about this for a very long time and achieving very little. The solutions are here. We could sit down and spend a day and come up with a whole list of them. The question is, how do we put together the leadership and the will and the reasons to undertake those in which we can get a consensus among our allies and friends? That is the challenge that we face in what I call a mad-driven world by the threat of massive attacks of disruption.
I'd like to take this moment to ask the audience while we have 10 minutes left, please post any questions, and the moderator, the organizers will share them with me so I can share them with the panel. Radu, I'm curious what you think the pandemic may have done in terms of exposing the weaknesses of any of Europe's enemies.
It's a good provocation. Thank you, Kim. And I would like to continue what Harlan said. I think we must face it. It's a huge intelligence Russian success and Chinese success on spreading disinformation, fake news, manipulation, and propaganda, especially on social media, and the way they destabilized Western societies based on lies and fake news and disinformation. And look what kind of impact those intelligence Russian and Chinese operations had already in politics, in presidential debate in the United States and all over Europe. The next level of these huge intelligence threats from Russia and China to the Western world will be to transform the mentality and the willing of the people against all Western values. And the next level will be to construct political parties and governments that are against all the values that we have been built in the last 71 years since NATO was founded, since 1949. And I think this is the biggest provocation, and the threats are not coming from mainstream media. Mainstream media has tools of control, professional, congressional, all kind of control. But the real danger is on social media, and they knew that they could use these covert operations in order to fulfill their first target that was mentioned by General Gerasimov, the head of general staff from Russia, in 2013, in order to use non-military actions to destabilize the Western world. The success of this disinformation and fake news story on social media reminds us that they are at the 7th year of their success against us.
So, Ben, I'm curious. Radu is portraying a very, a scary possibility of people walking blindly, Big Brother-like, into some changing of their mentality and what drives their value systems. Do you think European and American societies are lack resilience and faith in their own systems that they could be swayed like that? And I'd also like to hear if any of y'all think that there's a way to see an opportunity of bridging the gaps and turning some of this aggression into cooperation.
Do you want me to answer
So,
that?
Well, let's Ben first and then over to you. I know they're still trying to. Soren, are you able to hear us? Unfortunately, no. Sorry, Ben. Go for it.
okay,
COVID.
real fast. The I have a more optimistic view than what Radu has laid out. He's accurate on the description of the danger, but I think that I see enough examples every day from in the United States as well as across with all of our allies and other countries. There is a resilience. There is an ability to adapt and learn and to address these challenges. But it seems like our nature is that we always need a catastrophe to wake up. I mean, that's things happen in Washington D.C. after there's a big disaster, and then people get serious about it. Which is why, at the end of the day, it always comes back to positive leadership and having somebody that a leader in Washington that can help unify people and help get past the level of dissent that's happening right now, and also that would restore trust in the United States. I spend most of my time living in Europe, and my German friends are always shaking their head like, what's going on? The United States, even though they love to criticize the United States for decades for policy things, they never questioned before our constitutional foundation, and that at the end of the day, they could count on the United States. I think if we can restore that, then we'll be better dealing with these challenges that Radu laid out so clearly.
Well, we may have a voting season where we've had more Americans voting this year than in decades. So that would be a positive thing. Harlan, over to you.
Sometimes it is enormously frustrating how we forget history. There was something called the Soviet Union and something called Vladimir Lenin. And Lenin developed active measures. Just remember history after the Soviet Union was formed. I think Putin is probably getting bored because it's so easy to deal with without spending any money. The internet research agency in St. Petersburg for a few electrons is driving us crazy. Make no mistake, one of the reasons why the British voted for Brexit was because of meddling by the Russians, period. Now, the problem is that our response generally is a military response. We've got to do something, we'll let the military do it. Warp speed for a vaccine. What we need is to put together a cogent, overarching strategy that realizes that disruption is the issue. We can turn that disruption around. Russia has profound weaknesses. As John McCain used to say, it's a gas station with nuclear weapons. That's not quite exactly true. China has got even larger problems, demographic, debt problems. My biggest concern about China, believe it or not, is an implosion, not tomorrow, but over the longer term, as with the Soviet Union. And so we have to take a look clearly as to what our strengths and weaknesses are and what we are trying to achieve. What we have to do with both China and Russia is to be able to contain their more nefarious activities. We need to be able to defend, and I think porcupine defense is the reason, one of the rationales. And we have to be able to engage. The fact that we're walking away from arms control negotiations with the Russians, the fact that we've got this idiotic tariff war with China, don't make any sense. We are not making use of our resources. NATO in the United States is the largest democratic machine in the world and ever that's been seen. And the unfortunate issue is that we let expediency and politics take charge. We have all the resources and assets if we can, in fact, put together a cogent plan to deal with this. And for the time being, the Russians and lesser so the Chinese are exploiting our weaknesses, and we are basically ignoring that. And unfortunately, for the time being, the balance is shifting towards them when, in fact, when you look at every other kind of metric, we should be far ahead.
A lot of provocative ideas there. Well, unfortunately, we have lost Soren, and in the 2 minutes we have left before the panel ends, I'd like to turn it back over to Radu and revisit the original idea of this panel. Can we basically spend on defense and spend our way out of this crisis? So, Radu, what would you spend on first because of the pandemic and what we've learned by it?
I think we must keep a certain level of investing in defense, like Romania has the engagement of 2% of GDP, because a good part of this investment in defense is also an investment on civilian, on economy. And let's take the great expertise of facing crisis from the military, because you know, the World Health Organization says that this pandemic is a war. So if it is a war, then we have to behave like in a military conflict and understand that we need that expertise and we need that defense to be part of our thinking and our reaction. This pandemic and other provocations are too important to be left only on civilians or only on military. We must act together until the crisis is ended. How many crises will be also in this pandemic? Will we have more other issues and threats coming? I think yes. So from this point of view, at least in the next decade, I will propose a stronger cooperation between civilian and military strategists to find good solutions to get out of the crisis.
Thank you so much. And with that, we are ending our panel on time. And thank you to Aspen and to the Defense Minister for joining us today.